Hello, Dr. Alvaro or Michael, whoever is grading this. This is my second super blog for Fortnite Battle Royale. So let's jump right into it, shall we? Alright, so from here, we just have some quick notes where I just explain that we're going to be going through the basics and then other things afterwards. So basically, if you don't know what Fortnite is, it's a 100 person battle royale, kind of like the Hunger Games or the book of that name. It's made in the Unreal Engine and has become very popular as of late. Some just interesting little data. I didn't really go too much into this, but the fact that it is a 2.5 by 2.5 kilometer map is very interesting, considering that it is loaded in at all times, in a way. There are no loading screens, is what I mean. It has 100 player networking, and most of the map has to be visible from the beginning, at least. A very low poly and minimalized version. So we have our standard lighting method. Now here we're just talking about the Phong shading, how it has reflectiveness, how it has color, how it has textures. The textures are done by, of course, UV data that's applied onto the texture. The texture then is applied onto the UV, or did I just say that? Whatever. From there, basically that gets put onto the texture and then loaded on as its diffused texture, or its diffused color, which is just the standard color, and that's going to be based on the light reflecting off of the image. We also have ambient lighting, which generally isn't as much there, but it's still the natural ambient light coming off of the object itself. And then we have specular, which is the shininess, and you can see there's some specular light right there. So from there, we have normal mapping. Normal mapping is really interesting because of, obviously, you don't want to have super high poly models, and this can help you cheat a little bit. You're not actually changing the vertex data faces, you're just writing different data for higher polygon versions, and then changing how the normal, so how the light is going to reflect it. So here I have some examples of normal maps, and those are done with sort of an RGB heat map-ish sort of thing. Skeletal animation. I'm not 100% sure how prevalent this is in CG, considering, but I think it's very interesting where you're going to have to go through different parts of this to get graphics in your game for things like models, and it has to do with mesh manipulation, so I think it applies. Basically, skeletal animation is based off of the manipulation of the vertices on the model, and they all have different weights to them, from an impact of 0 to 1 generally. So when the bones move, the respected vertice data moves. So we have two different ways that we can do this. We have IK and FK. FK is pretty standard. Basically, we have parent-child relationships, and the child relationships change depending on the parent node. So if the parent node moves up by 10 in world space, then in local space for the child, it will move up by 10 as well, and then that transformation will be applied into world space as well. Then we have inverse kinematics. This one's quite tricky, but basically what you're doing is you are, think of it like having dependencies of puppet strings onto your bones, and then they're basically being updated to represent correct rotations. There are multiple different ways of doing this, such as fabric, but that is a whole topic that I did a full presentation on, so I'm not going to go too into it. But the way that you're doing it is you're moving, you're going through samples and connecting the bones to look more natural, and that's the end result. They have optimized animations, which I found really interesting, was by changing around how they worked their animation. So if you're farther away, they just interpolate between morph targets, those running animations. And so in one example, they were doing a 30 frame animation, and then they just took every fourth frame of that animation and then interpolated in between them. This is really good for when you have a lot of things going on, or when you have things that don't need to be fully rendered because they're so far away. We have reflection mapping. Reflection mapping is quite interesting because it uses frame buffer object concepts and environmental mapping, of course. So basically the way that works is it generally is texture data that is stored onto spherical textures or something along the lines of that, and then from there we see manipulations of that based on how we're viewing it. You can also see that the reflections in this will change depending on the eye space of the player, and that's how it's going to basically reflect. We can also see that in the waves of the normals of this likely flat vertice are changing through the scene as time progresses, and that's probably with a sine or cos wave. I have a little snippet of code from the distortion effect that is kind of similar from what they're probably doing here. Anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing is pretty interesting, where you're trying to do smooth meshes and or have things look less hard, because you're basically sampling from. So this is a low version, and you can see that it's quite jagged, but this one's quite smooth. And in this, it samples data kind of from the sides and figures out some sort of middle that will make the edges look smooth. Then we have particle emissions, of course. Those are quite interesting, where they're leaving trails of objects that have velocity and have life cycles, and then they pretty much destroy themselves after they're done. There's not too much to go on that, but as you do it, you make objects that pretty much just self-destruct. It's a little bit self-explanatory there, so I didn't add code, but we're running out of time. I'm just afraid that we'll hit the 10-minute mark. We're at 7 right now, and this Bandicam version only runs 10 minutes. So cascaded shadows. Here we have an example of the farther you get away from something, the less details of shadows we'll have. So I had 3 different versions. One without shadows, one where you're starting to see them, and then the third, you're starting to see little breaks in between these shadows of trees, right? And that's showing more detail, and you'll have better shadows because of that. The interesting thing here is that Fortnite, depending on where you are, will transition from shadow maps of cascaded shadow or distance field shadow maps. Distance field shadow maps are pretty interesting because they are generally in Unreal, and due to the destructibility of Fortnite's objects, they can't bake in any shadows. And so shadows are quite computationally expensive when drawing, and so there are ways to getting around that. So in this example, I believe what they do is actually something that takes up quite a little bit more in terms of ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is going to just try to guess, based on the surroundings of the scene, what the light will look like because of the data that's been fed in. It's not going to be a correct, completely correct calculation, but it's going to assume kind of like how radiosity works. Here's an example down here of with distance field ambient occlusion on and off. Distance field ambient occlusion is more interesting than standard, because whereas standard will take into account kind of what is in the world space to the eye, distance field will take into consideration most of the things around it. Fortnite Mobile. So this is an interesting case, and this is actually one of the reasons I wanted to do this super blog. And I've also been playing a lot of Fortnite. But seeing that this game can run on mobile. I wanted to see the difference